Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
Hey, did you know that slavery is once again completely legal? Stacy.
Max, this is our first headline here. Modern slavery, the loss of innocence. Now, there are 27 million modern slaves, according to Free the Slaves. And this includes sex slaves, child soldiers, debt and labor bondage. And the interesting thing about this article here, Max, in 1850, the purchase price of a slave in the southern U.S. averaged the equivalent of $40,000. Today, according to Free the Slaves, a slave costs an average of $90.
That's deflation. Cost of slaves is going down. So, consequently, you've got this huge slave trade bubbling up from the global economic deflationary nightmare. It's all part of this global financial crisis.
Well, they're saying that, the cheap cost of oil and transport has reduced the cost of slavery, but also that the huge demand for cheap goods has driven much of the slavery, because a lot of it is child laborers throughout Africa and China and Latin America, and they're forced basically into working. And now this industry is second only to the arms trade in terms of the black market. It's $31.7 billion a year. People
should keep in mind that when those who argue against minimum wage, that the market should set wages, they don't take into consideration that the oligarchs and the plutocrats and the kleptocrats who run the system, of course, are always going to gravitate towards slave pay. The reason you have minimum wage standards set is because you need to defend against the tendency toward slave labor.
Again, these people say, the activists involved here, they say that the way to stop it, the number one way to stop this slavery of the 27 million people around the world, mostly women and children, is to reduce demand for cheap goods. That will never happen. Walmart customers will never agree to that. But Max, let's look at how the demand for cheap money has actually enslaved even more people. Lagarde urges recapitalization of Europe's banks. So this is Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, and she was speaking in Jackson Hole. And she's saying that the European banks need to recapitalize or else face more liquidity crunch. She says that mandatory recapitalization to bolster European banks' balance sheets should be key to cutting the chains of contagion.
Okay, now you're making a transition here from this idea of cheap goods, cheap sex, and cheap energy to cheap credit, to cheap money, which is leading to debt slavery, which I would imagine is much bigger than 27 million people around the world. And Lagarde, the new IMF head, her solution for the current crisis is to actually make money cheaper, which of course is going to drive more slavery, make goods cheaper, and it'll make the current problem much worse. Because after all, she represents the kleptocrats and the oligarchs and the slave dealers. She's a slave master.
One of the arguments that she poses for how European banks can recapitalize is to borrow from this new 440 billion euro European Stabilization Fund. So more debt.
Right. The new Euro Stabilization Fund starts off in debt. It's bankrupt from day one. So her idea is to borrow from this bankrupt institution, which only means that the debt-to-equity ratio for the global banking system is to be expanded. The same way that Glass-Steagall, when it was repealed, it expanded the debt burden. When the Commodity Futures Modernization Act was brought in, it expanded the debt-to-equity burden. What Lagarde's talking about is to expand the debt-to-equity burden. There's no other solution that she could possibly come up with because she's just an academic neoliberal wonk whose only purpose in life is to theoretically come up with new ways to expand the debt burden. Her solutions are absolutely anathema to something that would be beneficial to anyone except debt peddlers, of whom she represents.
Well, Max, speaking of too much debt as well, she also called for more aggressive policies on housing to halt the downward spiral of foreclosures, falling house prices, and deteriorating household spending. So again, all of that is about more debt, because house prices are too high, which is why there's too much debt for the American consumer. And yet she's saying American policymakers need to put a floor under the price.
Right. She's saying that the government should subsidize houses so that they stop falling so that the consumer can take on more debt. The banks and the consumer, as Steve Keen points out, are already 300% GDP in debt. The American government is already 100% GDP in debt. So again, she's using a theory that she has, that she cooked up in the back room of some classroom, saying that, well, you know, according to my théorie, je peux avancer la notion que peut ajouter le dette de la situation, et enfin, il y a une catastrophe. Il y a une catastrophe. Of course, because that's all she knows how to do. She is the devil in a skirt.
Well, Max, let's turn to one of her IMF poster children, and that's Ireland. Families in modern Ireland skip food to pay the mortgage. So remember, the IMF praises how obedient and quiet and unrioting the Irish are. But families in modern Ireland are going without food in order to meet the demand of mortgage debt. And in spite of this, the arrears and people unable to pay their debt is going up. So they turn to AIB, which is now a state-owned lender, and they have all these bad debts on their book, all the mortgage debts. And look at what their solutions are. Among the possible solutions being explored are intergenerational mortgages and debt forgiveness, where a part of the loan is written off in return for the bank taking a share of the home.
Intergenerational mortgage, intergenerational debt, is indentured servitude.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying at the top of the show. We're talking about the 27 million in the black market of slavery. This is open that these people, the entire nation of Ireland, they're bonded servants.
Feudalism. That's what the IMF represents, a return to the Middle Ages, a return to feudalism, a return to being born into debt and never being able to escape debt for your entire life. That's what things like the Magna Carta were about, or various institutions that came out of the Enlightenment. Lagarde is anti-Enlightenment. She wants to bring back lords and monarchs and aristocrats, kleptocrats, and put everybody onto a debt farm, a debt slavery model. That's her model for growth.
Well, again, at the top of the show, I mentioned that there are 27 million slaves that now cost on average $90 compared to the 1850s, where a U.S. slave would cost $40,000. Now, part of that reason was that they were owned for life, the slaves in the American South. Now they're only bought for a few months, a few weeks at a time until they're torn apart and not worth anything anymore anyway. But
well, let me interject for a second. One other reason is that cotton has been replaced with synthetics, which are petrochemical, and the price of oil has been artificially low for decades and decades. But now we see the reverse coming to us. The price of oil is moving up due to peak oil, due to increased warfare, which means that cotton's going to come back as a competitive way to manufacture clothing, and people are going to be picking cotton down there in the South once again.
But remember, also in the U.S. South, they were housed and clothed. So here you have the banks taking ownership of these homes, debt forgiveness is called, but then repackaging the mortgage to be intergenerational.
Oh, they'll be housed and clothed, all right. It's called prison. And this is, again, one of the biggest trends in the United States is the private prison industrial complex. America's got the biggest prison population in the world. They're all ready to go out there to the cotton fields, start picking cotton for Christine Lagarde and her new plantation model.
So let's move on to here. Here you have the IMF poster children in Ireland, debt slaves for life. EU working on a radical plan for banks. So it's only going to get worse. It's going to get worse for Ireland. It's going to get worse for Germany, France, Italy, Spain, all the European nations, because the officials from the European Central Bank and European Commission are considering offering central guarantees over certain types of debt issued by banks. This comes on top of information that is now emerging that this European Stabilization Fund, the 440 billion euro thing, it might be overturned by the German High Court September 7th. But in the meantime, the European Central Bank has been taking all sorts of toxic assets in the last few weeks from Spain and Italian banks. But who's going to take the burden? Who are the debt slaves for that? Who has to pay off all these bad debts?
Well, they're going to monetize these bad debts. The ECB, under Trichet, he would love not to be able to leave office having been the guy to monetize debt and turn the clock back on everything the Bundesbank represents, but it looks like he won't be able to escape without that mark on his reputation as the ultimate monetizing machine. And of course, this is again why the euro is going to be weaker against the only global currency that makes any sense, gold bullion.
Well, Trichet was the head of the ECB, and there was a battle between the Bundesbank, who are very much against this, and this is why it's going to the High Court in Germany. But when we have this slavery, we often find liberation art, and I want to turn to the fact that we do see liberation art happening. An artist's incendiary painting is his bank statement. So the artwork in question is Chase burning. As you see, Chase branch in Van Nuys, California, painted by Alex Schaefer, is burning. Now, he was outside the Chase branch painting this when he was visited by police. And they asked him, "Do you hate banks? Do you plan to do that to the bank?" Now, Alex Schaefer, the artist, responded, "The flames symbolize bringing the system down. Some might say that the banks are the terrorists."
Yeah, I mean, the cops are obviously harassing this guy. And somebody made a good point in the comments that Hollywood movies depict things blowing up all the time. The cops don't show up in the studio and say, "Are you planning on blowing up the things that you're depicting being blown up in your depiction of this?" No, I mean, it's just harassment by cops. They don't understand in America, particularly in California, that banks are terrorists, that they are basically the terrorist, and their children, the banking offspring of their joining, is created a new generation of terrorists, just like we see in other countries around the world. There's nothing to stop the terrorism, so they're spawning new terrorists. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, but the same sort of Harriet Beecher Stowe was met with the same sort of shock and outrage by the community when she depicted in, what was it, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the same thing. Here's a guy who's painting the truth of the situation. Now, Gary Kishner, a spokesman for Chase Bank, said his institution isn't sure what to make of Schaefer's art. He said, "It's a situation we don't take lightly. Hopefully this is not what his actions are. It's kind of scary. You don't know what other people are thinking. We have to look out for the safety of our customers and employees." So here's a guy who's burned down the global economy, enslaved, as we just saw, all these people in Ireland who are starving to death. They're choosing not to feed their children so that they can continue paying Chase.
Well, this artist is so revolutionary and so interesting that we're going to have him on our new Saturday show.
Oh, yes.
The new Saturday edition of the Keiser Report this weekend with this guy, this artist guy. What's his name?
He's not going to be on. He's going to be on next Tuesday's show, but this Saturday is our first edition of the Saturday edition, Max.
Okay, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way after this, so stay there.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Permission free. Accreditation free. Transport charges free. Arrangements free. Risk free. Stereotype free. Download free broadcast quality video for your media projects at freevideo.rt.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, you can't have cheap money without cheap oil. Time now to go to Issa Bloomy, a professor of Middle East and Balkan history and author of Chaos in Yemen, Societal Collapse, and the New Authoritarianism. Issa Bloomy, great to have you in the studio.
It's great to be here, Max.
All right, Issa Bloomy, we've been discussing banking and terrorism in the first half. Tell us how these two meet in Yemen.
Well, I would suspect there's a direct correlation between the kind of rise of personal indebtedness to private finance institutions that emerged in Yemen starting in the late 1990s and really caught on as a kind of possible resource for considerable profits for both local Yemeni power holders, stakeholders, and the outside world, banking world. And this is taking the form usually in of microfinance banking. There's particularly successful banks as far as the outside investors are concerned in this operation called Al Amal Bank, which was given a reward last year for distributing over 60,000 loans in Yemen for, of course, what microfinance is famous for, starting up small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. But what's turned out is that many of the clients of this bank are not either paying back these loans or cannot pay back these loans.
Okay, let me cut you off right there for a second and get into this microfinancing for a second, because we all know that microfinance was heralded as the solution for third world development. Famously, the women in Bangladesh were clients of Grameen Bank, and the head of Grameen Bank, Yanis, won a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, but now it seems as though it's a Trojan horse, that it's actually just a way to use debt, as we've seen it used many times before, to create debt slavery situations. So which is kind of predictable, first of all. Second of all, just could you do a bit of a digression here? What's the story with Yanis and Grameen Bank? He seems like he was pushed out and unceremoniously pushed to the curb because the professional financial terrorists, as I call them, have moved in, right?
Well, I couldn't really answer to that specific case, but certainly in the case of Yemen, there was a major meeting last year, at the end of last year. Again, this Amal Bank was given a big reward from the Islamic Development Bank, from Deutsche Bank, who all applauded the success. Indeed, Yemen is the kind of shining star in the Middle East region for this microfinancing. And again, going back to the initial point, is that over 60,000 people or projects were funded. Over 300,000 people are actually directly involved in this transfer of, at the micro level, of wealth to so-called entrepreneurs in Yemen. But it's turning out that they're directly, yes, they have taken on this responsibility of repaying those debts. Spun in very interesting ways by these major banks in the language of compliance with Islamic law, which is a very interesting phenomenon we see in the Gulf in particular.
Yeah, another quick, let me jump in here. This is, of course, a very interesting situation because Islamic law, Sharia law, doesn't allow usury, and which is interest, and especially predatory interest. And the way that they work around this is to capitalize projects in such a way as the stakeholders have a stake in the project, which is amortized over time, I guess you could say. So now, how do they get around that? Have the mullahs been corrupted by the banks as well? We got corrupt mullahs all over the Mideast who are microfinancing things totally in violation of Sharia law. Is that what's going on?
We do have imams who who declared indeed some forms of usury is acceptable according to our interpretation of Islamic law, which of course one raises your eyebrows when this is happening. But
my eyebrow is raised way up. I mean, I can see Jamie Dimon interpreting the Quran in this way, but the imams are supposed to be, sticking to the plan here.
And like any industry which has their annual conference, in many cases in Las Vegas, you have similar kinds of gatherings of international companies as well as local companies are ambitious potential managers who will help manage and reassert and redirect financial wealth to the hands of the needy people of Yemen has turned out to be like very much a Trojan horse, as you suggested. And I suggest that a lot of the violence that's happening now in Yemen has nothing to do with tribal alliances or the struggle over between Al-Qaeda or political party loyalties, but it's the lives of people that have directly been affected by such kinds of interventions. What would they call in the IMF world and the World Bank as structural adjustments are actually causing significant structural chaos in these kind of rural societies that have been targeted. They have wonderful assets which are particularly valuable and are used to, of course, used as collateral for these microloans.
What are the assets in Yemen?
Water, land, labor, right? We have these kind of people who are receiving these grants who are somewhat responsible for the communities. And in many ways, in the past, they were able to leverage some kind of access to the labor, the capacity of their community in order to gain political sustenance, usually through the very typical kind of game in which locals are able to negotiate with the state receive a little bit of rent from the state in return for compliance. What is happening here is that the state is being replaced by these kinds of pseudo-state institutions connected with the Deutsche Bank, connected with the Islamic Development Banks of the world. And now we have these entrepreneurs who have invested the future of their community, the land, the actual land, which is now being used for cash crops like khat, as opposed to food, which is now being imported in large amounts. Or indeed water, which is becoming such an important commodity in Yemen.
Yeah, I want to talk about water because, of course, water is used in the petroleum industry in a huge way. And so where Yemen might not be rich necessarily in oil, gas per se, but they've got the oil, which is needed in the region. Now, let's talk about an oil trading firm, Arcadia Petroleum. They've recently sued by regulators in the U.S. for rigging the Yemeni oil market via their agent in Yemen, tribal leader Hamid al-Hamar. Tell us about the role oil traders play in the unrest in Yemen and this character, the tribal leader, al-Hamar.
Al-Hamar is, interesting enough, a major player in domestic politics, local politics, and on occasion was an ally of Saudi Arabia in putting pressure on the regime way back in the 90s, mid-90s, well into the post-9/11 universe in which Yemen has become an important epicenter of the war on terrorism, which is very much directly connected to the exploitative dynamics of global finance, as we just started to talk about with microfinance, as well as oil. Yemen has suddenly discovered that its reserves has quadrupled since 2 years ago, which means by end of October of 2010, you had over 84 companies converging on Yemen seeking to gain extra access to these blocks, expanding their current concessions, or indeed getting new concessions, whether it's offshore or on land. But what brings Arcadia into all of this is that they've seen through this Al-Ahmar, who's a very powerful figure who sometimes is in government, sometimes is battling government for influence, that he was used as the kind of guy who would threaten other oil companies, who maybe wanted to get into the business and offers what's the term that we use? These brokers are actually making bids on the oil that's supposed to be going out as crude to the global market. Arcadia kind of cornered that market in Yemen. And what's interesting is that they were actually paying at below market prices at one point. Just on August 25th, despite all these efforts by the United States government to go after this Arcadia, which is a Norwegian, owned by some Norwegian fellow based in London, despite all the attempts by the United States government to sue this company and somehow open up Yemeni's markets to other bidders, outside bidders, American companies in particular, they still got a contract and they purchased 3 million barrels on August 25th of this year at a 93% discount from the current price of Brent crude.
So the underlying story here, the story I think we're trying to get at, is that oil, gas business is a very capital-intensive business. And while there was a lot of oil flowing and a lot of credit flowing, these two things were hand in hand moving this relationship forward. But now that you've hit peak credit, let's say in 2007, where credit's hard to get at, the banking industry is collapsing. So this is bringing to the surface really the nasty underbelly between banks and the oil company in these regions. So to get to the big macro scenario here, it's easy to see why a lot of people consider the bankers as the terrorists, and that the folks that are, get the press, the wild men with the bombs and whatnot, they're really just they're not minor players as compared to the bankers in the region, the microfinance bankers who are of course supported by the big money center banks, global banks, the Morgans, the Goldmans of the world, are really the nasty, insidious, destabilizing true terrorists. And now that you've got the oil running out and the credit running out, this is becoming more and more obvious. So, of course, as it becomes more and more obvious, there's a need to intensify the lie. And we see this, I think, in places like Libya, where the control of the light sweet crude is playing now a factor in the region. How is that going to, what's the blowback in Yemen? We've got about a minute left.
Yemenis are a little bit different because they still resist, and the Americans and the big players cannot find a reliable partner down there. They would have removed the regime yesterday if they could have, like what ultimately they decided with the resistance in Libya. At one point when they felt secure that they could actually back the rebels, that's when the NATO intervention came. That's when you started to see real troops, special ops guys on the ground really taking out Libya's regime. That you don't have in Yemen yet. And that's largely because there's people with very strong communities who are loyal to their communities first and foremost and are not easily be bought out by this kind of corrupting phenomena. So we in the world need to celebrate and embrace these kinds of micro struggles with the larger global financial powers. And I think Yemen is a perfect example where there really is still a capacity demonstrated by people to resist this. And if only Americans realized this, if only people in Europe realized this, and saw the example of the middle class in Egypt who lost everything when the stock market crashed. They were convinced to go and take out their savings and sell their gold and go buy into stock markets. And they lost everything in early January. That's why there was a revolution in Egypt. It's because people in the middle class joined the poor who are always protesting the fact that they couldn't afford food, the fact that they were not represented politically. This is what's happening in the West. You walk anywhere in Paris now, you see people sleeping on the streets. You go drive the highways from the airport to the downtown, you see all these tent cities outside this city. When is it when people actually come to their senses and realize that they have to do what Yemenis are doing? They have to do what people in Egypt tried to do. Successfully, unsuccessfully, history will tell.
So you're pretty constructive on Yemen at the moment in terms of dealing with the pernicious influence of big banks.
They're struggling. They're getting bombed by drones. They're getting bombed by kind of special operations. It's a tragic story, which nobody covers in these terms, but it is a resistance. People are resisting here.
Weapons of mass financial destruction.
They're resisting weapons of mass financial destruction.
All right, Issa Blooming, that's all the time for we have. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Nice to be here.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Issa Blooming. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.